I am writing this report because no one else will. Every senior official in the dominion of the Eternal Throne who outranks me has either resigned, been removed from their position, or developed a sudden and very convenient inability to recall the events of the past 2 years. The sovereign himself has not issued a public statement since the incident. The Expansion Synod has been dissolved. The Ministry of Conquest has been renamed 3 times in 18 months, as if changing the words on the door might change what happened behind it. So the task falls to me, Senior Doctrine Analyst Vaithari-san, Career Intelligence Officer, loyal servant of the throne for 12 years, to explain to whoever inherits what remains of this empire exactly how a species of soft, short-lived, fragile creatures from a small blue planet in the galactic west dismantled the most powerful civilization in recorded history without firing a single weapon, without losing a single soldier, and without breaking a single sweat. I need you to understand the scale of what I am describing before we proceed. The dominion of the Eternal Throne is not a minor kingdom. It is not a coalition of like-minded worlds or a loose federation held together by trade agreements and good intentions. The dominion has existed for 12,000 years. 900 distinct species live within its borders, spanning every classification of sentient life that the galaxy has produced. At any given moment, we maintain 400 active military campaigns across our territory and beyond it. War is not something the Dominion does. War is what the Dominion is. It is the engine of our economy, the foundation of our political system, the core curriculum of our educational institutions, and the primary metric by which we measure the worth of individuals, families, and entire civilizations. We have ministries dedicated to managing conflicts that predate the birth of most spacefaring species. We have officers whose family lines have served in the same theater of operations for 30 generations, passing down command authority the way other cultures pass down heirlooms. Our supply chains stretch across 100,000 star systems. Our fleets number in the tens of thousands of capital-class warships, and each one of those ships carries enough firepower to sterilize a planet's surface in a matter of hours. We are the largest, most battle-hardened, most ruthlessly efficient military civilization the galaxy has ever produced. We have been conquering species since before most of them learned to use tools. We have never, in 12 millennia, encountered a challenge we could not overcome through the application of overwhelming force. And a species with fewer than 800 employees in their entire military apparatus made us look like children playing with sticks in the dirt. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not 800,000. Not 800 million, 800 individuals. That is the total staffing of the only institution in human civilization that could be described as serving a military function. 800 people brought the dominion of the Eternal Throne to its knees, without a single act of violence, without a single ship-to-ship engagement, without a single casualty on either side. Let me start from where it all went wrong, because it did not begin with the invasion. It began with a footnote. Humans were first catalogued approximately 40 years before the incident. A long-range survey team operating in the far galactic west flagged a young species that had recently developed faster-than-light travel capabilities. The initial contact report was filed under standard protocols and classified as routine. Their technology was competent, but not exceptional. Their fleet was modest in size and unremarkable in composition. Their economy was healthy and growing, but posed no competitive threat to any established power. They occupied 61 star systems in a corridor of space that the Dominion had not yet prioritized for expansion. This placed them firmly in the category of a mid-tier regional power, the kind of civilization that the Dominion typically absorbs without even adjusting its quarterly military budget. The survey team spent 4 standard rotations, compiling their assessment. They cataloged human technology, population demographics, resource extraction capabilities, industrial output, and defensive infrastructure. All standard. All unremarkable. The kind of data that fills filing cabinets by the thousands across the Dominion's intelligence apparatus. But there was one anomaly. It was buried deep in the cultural appendix of the report, in the section that nobody reads because cultural data is considered soft intelligence, the kind of thing that academics care about, but that has no bearing on military planning. A junior analyst on the survey team, a young woman named Specialist Dren, had noted, with apparent confusion, that the humans had not fought a single external war since developing faster than light travel. Not one conflict, not one border skirmish, not one punitive expedition against a neighboring species, not one defensive engagement. In over 2 centuries of interstellar expansion, during which they had encountered dozens of other spacefaring civilizations, they had settled every dispute exclusively through what their records described as resolution protocols. The analyst flagged this datum as highly unusual and recommended further investigation. The recommendation was noted and filed. No further investigation was conducted. I wish I could say I noticed that flag when I reviewed the complete file years later as part of the pre-invasion assessment. I did not. I skimmed the cultural appendix the way everyone skims the cultural appendix, looking for religious prohibitions against surrender or cultural concepts of honor that might complicate occupation governance. I found nothing of concern. The humans, according to our data, were pragmatic, rational, and showed no signs of the suicidal bravery that some species display when cornered. They would be a straightforward absorption. I moved on to the next section of the file. I have replayed that moment 10,000 times in my mind. The moment I turned the page. The moment I decided that a civilization's complete absence of warfare in 200 years of interstellar existence was not worth a second look. It is the smallest moment of my life, and it is the one that matters most. The decision to absorb human space came from the Expansion Synod during its quarterly territorial review, as all acquisition decisions do. There was no particular animosity toward the humans, no ancient grudge, no cultural conflict, no perceived threat. The Synod needed a strategic buffer zone against the Therakari Compact, a rival power block that had been expanding along the galactic east. Human space sat in a geographically convenient corridor between Dominion territory and the Compact's projected expansion vector. Absorbing those 61 systems would give the Dominion a defensible buffer and a forward staging area for potential future operations against the Therakari. That was the entire calculation. A line on a star chart, a logistical convenience, the kind of cold, dispassionate arithmetic that the Dominion has performed 600 times in its 12,000-year history. We did not hate the humans. We did not fear them. We barely thought about them at all. They were simply in the way. I was part of the pre-invasion assessment team. I personally authored the sections of the strategic analysis that rated human military resistance as moderate, declining to negligible within the first rotation of active operations, and estimated total pacification time at 3 standard rotations. I reviewed their fleet composition in detail. I analyzed their industrial output and calculated how quickly they could produce replacement vessels under wartime conditions. I mapped their population distribution and identified the key administrative centers whose capture would most efficiently disrupt their governmental capacity. I studied their defensive infrastructure and found it adequate for repelling pirates and minor aggressors, but wholly insufficient to resist a sustained Dominion campaign. Everything pointed to a straightforward operation, 3 rotations, maybe 4 if the humans proved marginally more stubborn than predicted, and their 61 systems would be just another administrative district paying tribute to the Eternal Throne. I signed my name to that assessment. I stamped it with my professional seal, the seal that represents 12 years of intelligence work, hundreds of successful analyses, and a career built on the principle that data does not lie. Every morning since the incident, I wake up and feel the weight of that signature pressing against my chest like a stone that will not move. The subjugation decree was drafted by the Ministry of Conquest and delivered to the human government through standard diplomatic channels. It was a formal document, beautifully formatted on ceremonial parchment, carrying the golden seal of the Eternal Throne, and countersigned by 14 of the 17 members of the Expansion Synod. It gave the human government, which they called the United Human Governance, 30 standard cycles to accept full integration into the Dominion, including military disarmament, economic restructuring, political reorganization, and the payment of tribute. Failure to comply would result in military absorption, a polite term for invasion, conquest, and forced integration. This is the way we have communicated with 600 civilizations before them. The decree is not negotiable. It is not an opening position. It is a statement of fact delivered with the understanding that the recipient has no meaningful ability to resist. Most species surrender immediately upon receiving it. The rest negotiate for slightly better terms, perhaps a reduced tribute schedule or limited cultural autonomy, before surrendering. A handful resist, briefly and futilely, and are crushed with enough force to serve as an example for the next recipient of a subjugation decree. No species in the history of the Dominion has ever responded to a subjugation decree the way the humans did. Their response arrived 11 cycles later. It was a single page. In our experience, the length of a response correlates with the degree of fear behind it. Long responses are full of arguments and pleas and counterproposals, the desperate output of a government trying to find any alternative to the inevitable. Short responses are surrenders. The human response was neither. It was written in language so plain and so direct that our translation algorithms initially flagged it as a possible formatting error, because surely no species facing the full military weight of the dominion of the Eternal Throne would respond with such casual, unhurried certainty. The message read, in its entirety, "We acknowledge receipt of your subjugation decree, dated reference code attached. We strongly recommend you withdraw this decree within the stated time frame. We do not engage in wars. If you proceed with military action, we will not fight you. We will end you. This is not rhetoric or bluster. This is a scheduling notice. We have allocated resources accordingly. Please confirm withdrawal at your earliest convenience." I was present in the Synod chamber when that message was read aloud to the assembled military leadership. The room held 60 of the most powerful military commanders in galactic history. Beings who had burned worlds and shattered fleets and ground entire civilizations into obedient dust. They laughed, not nervously, not with uncertainty. They laughed with the full-throated confidence of predators who have never met anything they could not consume. It was the laughter of absolute, unquestioned certainty in one's own supremacy. It lasted approximately 6 seconds. The invasion order was signed that same afternoon. There was no debate. There was no further analysis. The humans had amused the Synod, and now the Synod would teach them the cost of amusement. Admiral Dren Kossar, a decorated veteran of 43 planetary campaigns, was given command of the 14th Combined Armada. 800 warships, 200,000 ground troops, enough orbital bombardment capacity to glass a dozen worlds, enough supplies for a sustained campaign of 18 standard rotations, though no one expected the operation to last more than 3. I was assigned as the senior intelligence analyst aboard the command carrier, the Throne of Silence, because the Synod wanted real-time doctrinal assessment as the campaign progressed. This was standard practice for a campaign of this scale. My role was to observe, analyze, and provide the Admiral with contextual intelligence to inform his operational decisions. I accepted the assignment with pride. It was a career-defining opportunity. We departed 4 cycles later. 800 warships in perfect formation, their engines burning bright enough to be seen across 3 systems. The fleet stretched out behind the Throne of Silence like a river of steel and fire, each vessel in its precise position, each crew at their station, each weapon charged and ready. It was, by any objective measure, one of the most impressive displays of military force the Dominion had assembled in a century. I stood on the observation deck of the Throne of Silence and watched the fleet extend to the horizon of visible space. I felt proud. I felt certain. I felt the quiet, professional satisfaction of a man doing work that he understood completely, surrounded by colleagues who shared his confidence, serving an institution that had never failed. I think about that moment often now, the pride, the certainty, the satisfaction. I think about how complete those feelings were, how total, how untroubled by doubt. And I think about the fact that somewhere, in a quiet office on a quiet planet, circling an unremarkable star, a human bureaucrat with a coffee mug on her desk had already scheduled the exact date and time our certainty would die. She had assigned it a case number. She had filed the preliminary paperwork. She had allocated personnel and resources and probably blocked out time on her calendar for the follow-up meeting. We laughed at their message for 6 seconds. It cost us everything. The 14th Combined Armada crossed into human space on the morning of the 42nd cycle, after the subjugation decree was issued. Standard Dominion invasion doctrine dictated a 3-phase approach that we had refined over centuries of successful application. Phase 1. seize the three outermost colony systems to establish forward operating bases and secure supply lines. Phase 2, advance inward along the major transit corridors, capturing industrial centers and communication nodes. Phase 3, encircle and isolate the core systems, cutting off the central government from its remaining territory until capitulation became the only rational option. It was a textbook campaign plan. We had executed this exact strategy, with minor variations, against 400 different species across 900 years. It always worked. Always. The first system we entered was designated Harmon's Reach in human records. A mid-sized colony world, population estimated at 60 million souls, orbiting a yellow dwarf star with moderate industrial infrastructure, and 3 orbital stations providing shipyard and refining capacity. Our advanced scouts, a squadron of 12 fast corvettes, dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the system's edge and immediately began scanning for defensive emplacements, minefields, patrol squadrons, and the other standard preparations that every species deploys when an invasion fleet approaches their territory. They found nothing, not reduced defenses, not token resistance, nothing, absolute, pristine, echoing nothing. Harmon's Reach was empty, not destroyed, not damaged, not scarred by hasty demolition or last-minute sabotage, empty. The orbital stations were powered down to standby mode, their running lights dark, their docking bays clear. The surface installations were cold and silent. The shipyards held no vessels. The mining facilities had been shut down through proper decommissioning procedures. The residential zones held no people. 60 million human beings had simply, quietly, and completely left. Their infrastructure remained behind, clean and orderly, like a house where the family had packed their belongings, swept the floors, cleaned the windows, and turned off the lights before walking out the front door and locking it behind them. Our ground teams swept the colony over the following 2 days. They found personal belongings left in organized storage containers, labeled and cataloged as if the owners expected to return for them someday. They found food preservation systems still running in automated mode, maintaining supplies that no one would eat. They found children's drawings pinned to walls in what appeared to be educational facilities. Small, colorful depictions of alien worlds and strange creatures, the universal artwork of young minds imagining what lies beyond the horizon. Everything was intact. Everything was arranged with meticulous care. Everything suggested a population that had departed not in panic, but on a precisely maintained schedule, with time to spare and not a shred of urgency. Admiral Kossar received the ground team reports with visible irritation. He interpreted the empty colony as evidence of cowardice and ordered the fleet to advance to the second target system immediately, then the third, then the fourth. Each time, he expected to find the human military making a stand, choosing their ground, preparing for the fight that every species eventually commits to when pushed far enough. Every single system was identical, empty, clean, evacuated with a logistical precision that made our supply officers stare at their data screens in uncomfortable silence. The colonies were not abandoned. They were vacated. There is a difference that matters enormously if you are an intelligence analyst, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, even if I could not yet articulate why. Our best estimates, based on population records and transport capacity analysis, suggested that the humans had relocated over 300 million people from their outer colonies in less than 20 standard cycles. 300 million. The logistics of moving that many individuals across interstellar distances in that time frame were staggering, even by Dominion standards. And they had done it without visible transport convoys, without detectable communication traffic, without any of the 1,000 logistical signatures that a mass evacuation of that scale should produce. They had moved an entire civilization's worth of people, and we had not detected a single ship doing it. I filed my first formal warning report on day 6 of the invasion. I wrote in language as careful and measured as I could manage while still conveying genuine urgency that the pattern we were observing across multiple star systems was fundamentally inconsistent with retreat. Retreat is messy. It is chaotic. It leaves behind stragglers and abandoned equipment and communication fragments and panic transmissions and all the 1,000 small signs of a population in flight. What we were seeing was none of those things. What we were seeing was a civilization clearing the table before sitting down to eat. The silverware was arranged. The napkins were folded. The candles were lit. The only thing missing was the meal, and I did not want to be present when it arrived. Admiral Kossar read my report in his quarters, while I stood at attention before his desk. He set it down, looked at me with the patient condescension of a veteran commander addressing a nervous analyst, and said that cowards run. It is what cowards do. He had seen 100 species flee before the Dominion, and this was no different. The humans would either run until they had nowhere left to run, at which point they would surrender, or they would make a stand somewhere in their core systems, at which point they would be destroyed. Either way, the outcome was predetermined. My job was to provide useful intelligence, not to worry about empty houses. I saluted and returned to my station. I did not file another warning report. That is a failure I carry with me alongside the signature on the pre-invasion assessment. 2 failures stacked on top of each other, each one enabling the next. By day 10, we had advanced through 7 human systems, without a single shot fired, without a single human vessel detected, without a single defensive system activated, without a single communication intercepted. 7 star systems, perfectly preserved, completely devoid of human presence. The fleet moved through them like a parade through empty streets, and the silence was starting to affect morale in ways that the officers did not acknowledge and the enlisted crews could not articulate. The officers were elated, on the surface. They were already filing administrative requests for occupation governance postings in the conquered territory, already calculating their promotion timelines based on the speed of the campaign, already drafting after-action reports celebrating the bloodless conquest of human space. In their minds, this was the fastest, cleanest territorial acquisition in modern Dominion history, and they wanted their names attached to it. But the enlisted crews and the junior analysts, the people who spent their shifts staring at sensor screens and communication monitors and seeing nothing, felt something different. Something that did not yet have a name, but that settled in the gut, like a weight you could not shift. I heard them talking in the mess halls, in the corridors, in the quiet spaces between shifts where rank relaxes and people say what they actually think. They used words like wrong and off and too quiet. One sensor technician, a young male named Drekis, told me during a late shift that it felt like walking through a forest where the animals had stopped making sound. Not because the forest was empty, because something in the forest had made them go silent. I remember that conversation because Drekis was exactly right, and none of us, including me, were wise enough to act on the instinct he was describing. I spent those quiet, empty days doing what I should have done before we departed Dominion space. I pulled every scrap of data on human civilization that existed in our intelligence archives. I read their publicly available governmental records. I studied their institutional framework in detail. I cross-referenced their bureaucratic structure with the structures of every species the Dominion had ever conquered, looking for patterns and precedents. And I found the thing that should have stopped this invasion before it ever started. Humans had no war ministry. They had no Ministry of Defense, no joint military command structure, no strategic planning division, no weapons development bureau, no fleet command, no ground force headquarters. Nothing, absolutely nothing, that corresponded to the vast military bureaucracy that every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy maintains as a basic function of sovereignty. It was not that they had a small military, it was that they had no military at all, not in any form that the Dominion would recognize as such. Instead, they had a single, small, modestly funded government agency. It was called the Conflict Termination Bureau. It had fewer than 800 employees across all departments, including administrative and support staff. Its annual budget was smaller than the catering allocation for a single Dominion fleet command. Its public charter, freely available to any species that cared to access human governmental records, described its mission in a single sentence that I have since committed to memory because it is the most important sentence I have ever read. The systematic and permanent cessation of organized hostility through the removal of the aggressor's capacity to sustain conflict. Not to win wars, not to defend territory, not to defeat enemies, not to project power, not to deter aggression, not to achieve military objectives of any kind. To terminate conflict, to end it, permanently, by removing the aggressor's ability to continue, not their will, their ability. The distinction matters more than anything I have ever written in any intelligence report. I read that charter 7 times, sitting alone at my workstation on the bridge of the Throne of Silence, while 7 conquered star systems sat empty behind us, and the rest of human space waited ahead, quiet and patient and dark. Each time I read it, the words meant something slightly worse. Each time, the sentence rearranged itself in my mind, revealing another layer, like a puzzle box that keeps opening to show a smaller, more intricate box inside. On day 12, I requested an urgent private briefing with Admiral Kosser. I brought my research. I brought my analysis. I brought the growing, gnawing, inescapable certainty that we were not conquering empty space. We were being allowed to walk deeper and deeper into something we could not see and could not understand. And the deeper we walked, the less it would matter when we finally realized what was happening. Kosar gave me 4 minutes. He was busy reviewing the administrative plans for the occupied territories, assigning governance officers, scheduling tribute collection timelines. He considered the campaign effectively over. I used 3 of my 4 minutes explaining what the Conflict Termination Bureau was, what its charter said, and what it implied about the human approach to the situation we were creating. I explained that no species in galactic history had ever structured its entire defensive capability around the concept of termination rather than deterrence or victory. I explained that the distinction was not semantic but fundamental, because a species that prepares to terminate conflicts rather than win them is operating from a completely different strategic framework than anything the Dominion has ever encountered. I used my 4th minute to recommend, as strongly as I could within the bounds of military protocol, an immediate withdrawal of the entire 14th Armada to Dominion space, pending a comprehensive intelligence reassessment of human capabilities. Kosar stared at me for a long time after I finished. His expression was not angry. It was not dismissive. It was the expression of a man who genuinely cannot connect the words he is hearing to any reality he recognizes. Then he said, "You want me to retreat from an enemy that is not here, based on the job description of a government office with fewer employees than my personal staff. Is that correct, Analyst Son?" When he put it that way, it sounded absurd. It sounded like the ramblings of an analyst who had spent too long staring at empty sensor screens and had begun to see threats in the silence. And so I said nothing more. I saluted. I returned to my station, and I waited for whatever was coming, because by that point, I was certain something was coming, even if I could not tell Kosser what it was, or where it would come from. That was at morning. At evening, the first sensor post went dark. Not a sensor post on our invasion route. Not a sensor post anywhere in human space. A deep space sensor post on the Dominion's home border, on the eastern perimeter, on the opposite side of the Empire from where we sat in our 800 warships, 23,000 light-years from the 14th Armada. As far from the invasion as it was physically possible to be while remaining within Dominion territory. Then another post went dark, then a third, then 40 in sequence, tracing a line across the Dominion's eastern perimeter like a fingernail drawn slowly and deliberately across bare skin. Each one winking out on the status board, green to amber, in a pattern that was too regular to be coincidence, and too precise to be natural. No distress signals were transmitted. No energy weapon signatures were detected. No explosions registered on any sensor array within range. The posts simply stopped transmitting Dominion identification codes. When diagnostic pings were sent to verify their status, the posts responded perfectly. Their systems were fully operational. Their power cores were active. Their sensor arrays were functioning within normal parameters. They simply no longer recognized Dominion communication protocols. They had been reprogrammed, seamlessly and without interruption, to answer to someone else. I stood on the bridge of the Throne of Silence and watched the status board update in real time. 40 green indicators turning amber, one after another, in a smooth progression across the map that looked less like an attack and more like someone running their finger along a row of switches, flipping each one in turn, casually, without hurry, without effort. Not red. The posts were not destroyed. They were not damaged. They were not compromised in any way that our diagnostics could identify. They were simply no longer ours. Admiral Cosser stood beside me, watching the same board. I requested, through proper channels, a priority status report from Dominion Central Command. The response should have arrived within seconds. Our quantum-entangled communication links operated at effectively instantaneous speed across any distance. The delay should have been limited to the processing time required for a staff officer to read my request and compose an answer. The response took 14 minutes. When it arrived, it was 3 words long: investigating, stand by. In 12 years of service as a Dominion intelligence officer, I had never received a communication from Central Command that contained fewer than 3 paragraphs. The Dominion does not do brevity. The Dominion does not say stand by. The Dominion issues directives and expects compliance, and fills every communication with layers of protocol and formality and the accumulated bureaucratic weight of 12,000 years of institutional tradition. A 3-word response from Central Command was not just unusual. It was a sign that whoever typed those 3 words could not think of anything else to say, and that the reason they could not think of anything else to say was that their hands were shaking too hard to type. I looked at Admiral Cosser. He was staring at the status board with an expression I had never seen on his face. His jaw was set, his breathing was controlled, but his hands, which were normally in constant motion, gesturing and pointing and signing orders, had stopped. They hung at his sides, perfectly still. Cosser was a man of perpetual momentum. Stillness in Cosser was the equivalent of a scream in any other officer. I understood, standing there on the bridge of the Throne of Silence, watching the lights change on a board that mapped an empire 23,000 light-years across, what the phrase, "We will not fight you," actually meant. It was not a bluff. It was not defiance. It was a precise, literal, technical description of their operational approach. The humans had no fleet opposing our armada because our armada was irrelevant. Completely, totally, structurally irrelevant. We were 800 warships conquering empty rooms, while the real operation was happening on the other side of the galaxy. We were not the target. We were not even the distraction. A distraction, at least, serves a purpose in the strategy that employs it. We served no purpose at all. We were simply not a factor in whatever the humans were actually doing. We had brought the largest invasion fleet assembled in a century to conquer a species that had already moved past the concept of fleets entirely. We were playing a game they had stopped playing 200 years ago. That evening, at precisely the moment when the implications of the eastern border situation were beginning to filter through the officer corps, the Throne of Silence's primary communication relay to Dominion Central Command went silent. Not jammed, not destroyed, not damaged in any detectable way. The relay station, a massive orbital installation positioned in a system 3 jumps behind us, was physically intact, fully powered, with every diagnostic reading showing green across every system. It simply no longer recognized Dominion encryption certificates. When our communication officers attempted to re-authenticate using backup protocols, the relay responded with a security challenge that did not exist in any Dominion codebook. It was asking for credentials that we did not possess, that we had never possessed, that no Dominion system should have been programmed to request. The relay was still there. It still worked. It was communicating with something or someone. It just was not communicating with us. I stood in the communication center of the Throne of Silence, surrounded by officers and technicians who were all staring at the same screens, and all arriving at the same conclusion that none of them wanted to speak aloud. And I felt something I had never experienced in 12 years as a military intelligence professional. It was not fear. Fear implies a threat you can identify and evaluate and respond to. This was something deeper and worse. This was the sensation of standing inside a strategy so vast, so precisely engineered, and so flawlessly executed that I could not find its edges. I could not see where it began. I could not see where it ended. I could not tell if we were inside it or outside it, or if the distinction between inside and outside even applied to whatever this was. We were not at war. That much was becoming violently, unmistakably, undeniably clear. Whatever was happening to the dominion of the Eternal Throne, the word war did not describe it. War implies 2 sides engaged in a contest with a beginning and an end, and rules of engagement, and the possibility that either side might prevail. This was not a contest. This was not a battle. This was not even an operation in any military sense of the word. This was a procedure, and we were not the opponent. We were the patient. 72 hours. That is how long it took for the dominion of the Eternal Throne, the largest and most powerful military empire in galactic history, to discover that it no longer existed as a functional entity. Not destroyed, not conquered, not defeated in battle, not overthrown by revolution or undermined by internal decay, simply switched off, like a machine, by someone who knew where the switches were and had been standing next to them, patiently, for 40 years, waiting to see if we would give them a reason to reach out and flip them. We gave them the reason. They flipped the switches. I am going to reconstruct those 72 hours as precisely as I can from the fragmented reports, personal logs, intercepted communications, and post-event debriefing transcripts that I have spent the past 18 months compiling. I need to warn you before we proceed. What I am about to describe is not a battle. There is no glory in it. There are no heroes charging into enemy fire, or admirals making brilliant last-stand decisions under impossible pressure. There are no dramatic fleet engagements or daring boarding actions, or noble sacrifices. There is only the slow, dawning, stomach-churning realization that the ground beneath your feet was removed 6 days ago, and you have been standing on nothing but habit and assumption ever since. It began with the money, at a time we later determined to be synchronized to the galactic standard second across every system simultaneously. Every financial node in the Dominion's interstellar banking network reset to its factory default configuration. Every single one. Every branch. Every server. Every backup. Every redundant system. Every offline archive. Simultaneously. Across all 900 member systems. Transaction histories spanning centuries of commerce were erased. Account balances for every individual, institution, and government entity in the Dominion returned to zero. Credit authorizations, military funding allocations, government payroll systems, trade agreements, debt instruments, pension funds, insurance reserves, commodity futures, and currency exchange protocols all vanished. Not stolen, not encrypted for ransom, not corrupted or scrambled, simply erased and replaced with blank factory templates, as if the entire financial infrastructure of a 12,000-year-old empire had just been unpacked from its original shipping container for the very first time. The immediate effects cascaded faster than anyone could respond to them. Military supply requisitions could not be processed because the authorization codes that validated them no longer existed in any database. Fuel shipments to forward-deployed fleets could not be paid for because the accounts that funded them now showed zero balances with no transaction history. Soldiers across 400 active theaters of war stopped receiving pay. Civilian contractors who built ships and maintained stations and manufactured weapons could not invoice for their services. The cargo vessels that carried food and medicine and replacement parts to 1,000 garrison worlds across the Empire could not pay docking fees or purchase fuel for their return journeys. In a civilization that runs on institutional momentum, the money is the momentum. The money is what converts orders into actions, plans into operations, decisions into outcomes. Without it, the chain of command becomes a chain of suggestions. Without it, a fleet admiral's order to advance carries exactly the same practical weight as a street vendor's opinion about the weather. The momentum stopped. The Empire kept moving, briefly, on inertia alone. But inertia without momentum is just coasting, and coasting ends the same way every time. But the money was only the first layer. 12 hours after the financial systems collapsed, the navigational buoy network began to malfunction. The Dominion's faster-than-light travel infrastructure depends on a galaxy-spanning grid of synchronized navigational beacons planted across hundreds of thousands of star systems. These beacons provide the precise reference coordinates that allow ships to calculate safe transit paths through folded space. The physics of faster-than-light travel are unforgiving. A deviation of less than 1% in entry coordinates can result in a ship emerging thousands of light-years from its intended destination, or inside the gravity well of a star, or in the heart of a particle-dense nebula, where the radiation would strip its hull in seconds. The beacons prevent this. They are the road signs of interstellar civilization. Without them, every jump is a gamble, and the odds are not favorable. The beacons did not go offline. That would have been simpler. That would have been something we could diagnose and repair. A straightforward infrastructure failure that our engineering corps had dealt with 1,000 times. Instead, the beacons began transmitting incorrect coordinates, not random coordinates. Specific, carefully selected, deliberately wrong coordinates designed to route ships into danger. Ships that followed the beacon's guidance would emerge in empty space, light years from any system, or inside the crushing gravity wells of dead stars, or in the dense particle clouds of active stellar nurseries where the radiation environment would overwhelm their shielding within hours. Someone had not just broken the navigation system, someone had turned it into a trap. Every jump became a potential death sentence. Every destination became a lie whispered by a beacon that still looked and sounded exactly like it always had. Military traffic across the Empire came to an immediate halt as the first reports of misdirected ships reached fleet commands. Civilian traffic followed within hours, as news of the navigation failures spread through whatever communication channels were still functioning normally. Commercial shipping stopped. Emergency services stopped. Troop transports stopped. The empire that depended on the constant, reliable movement of ships and goods and personnel between its 900 systems began to suffocate, system by system, as each world became an island cut off from every other. Then came the communications. The Dominion's quantum-entangled communication grid is the nervous system of the Empire. It carries military orders, intelligence briefings, diplomatic correspondence, civilian news broadcasts, commercial data, emergency alerts, and the 10,000 daily administrative messages that hold a multi-species galactic empire together as a functioning whole. It is the single most critical piece of infrastructure the Dominion possesses, more important than any fleet or any weapon, because without communication, there is no coordination, and without coordination, there is no empire. Just 900 planets sitting in the dark. The grid is layered with encryption protocols that have been continuously refined for 900 years. It has never been broken. Every intelligence service in the galaxy, including several that exist solely to attempt exactly this kind of breach, has tried and failed. The Dominion's communication security has been an article of faith among our military leadership for generations. It is the one thing we do not worry about, because we have never had to. The humans did not break the encryption. They did not attempt to break it. They did not need to. They simply rerouted the delivery system. Every message sent through the grid was delivered successfully, completely intact, with its encryption fully preserved. It just arrived at the wrong recipient. Fleet orders intended for the Third Strike Group were delivered, perfectly encrypted and authenticated, to the Ministry of Agricultural Development on a farming world in the galactic south. Planetary defense activation codes for a fortress world on the northern border appeared, correctly formatted and fully valid, in the incoming queue of a children's entertainment network that broadcast educational programming to a dozen colony systems. Intelligence briefs marked at the highest possible classification level, containing the names and locations of embedded agents, the disposition of reserve fleets, and the activation codes for strategic weapons platforms, were deposited into public civilian news feeds across 40 systems simultaneously. The Dominion began broadcasting its own most closely guarded secrets to itself, and every citizen with a communication terminal could watch them scroll by in real time. Within hours, classified military positions, fleet movements, agent identities, defense vulnerabilities, strategic contingency plans, and the personal communications of senior officials were circulating freely through civilian channels. Centuries of carefully maintained operational security evaporated in an afternoon. Not because someone had stolen our secrets through espionage or subterfuge, but because our own communication system, the system we trusted above all others, had cheerfully decided to share everything with everyone. The chaos that followed was not the chaos of battle. It was the chaos of a civilization discovering that it could not trust its own infrastructure. Ships that received orders could not confirm they were genuine. Orders that were genuine could not be verified, because the verification systems used the same compromised grid. Intelligence that was accurate could not be distinguished from intelligence that had been intercepted and altered. The entire information architecture of the Dominion became unreliable, and an empire that cannot trust its own information is an empire that cannot function. I learned most of these details later, during the extensive debriefings that followed the incident. At the time, stranded with the 14th Armada in empty human space, cut off from Central Command, all I could see were fragments. A garbled partial report about banking system failures that ended mid-sentence. A truncated emergency warning about navigation hazards that arrived on a frequency reserved for routine weather updates. A burst of unencrypted text that appeared to be a classified summary of the Dominion's strategic weapons deployment, complete with activation codes, transmitted in the clear on a frequency normally used by civilian weather satellites. From those fragments, pieced together over hours of work at my station on the bridge of the Throne of Silence, I assembled a picture. An incomplete picture. A terrifying picture. But a picture clear enough to understand what was being done to us, even if I could not yet understand how. The humans had not attacked the Dominion's military. They had not targeted our ships, our soldiers, our weapons platforms, our fortress worlds, or any of the vast arsenal of destructive capability that we had spent 12,000 years assembling. They had targeted the three systems that make a military and an empire possible. The money that pays for everything, the navigation that moves everything, the communication that coordinates everything. Remove those three pillars, and a fleet is just a collection of metal objects floating in empty space. Remove those three pillars, and an empire is just a collection of planets that happen to be near each other, but can no longer speak or trade or cooperate, or function as a unified whole. The humans had identified the three load-bearing walls of our civilization and removed them simultaneously, with synchronized precision, across a territory spanning 23,000 light-years. The structure was still standing, every ship was still intact, every soldier was still alive, every planet was still turning, every weapon was still loaded. But none of it worked. None of it connected. None of it could coordinate or move or function as part of a larger whole. The pieces of the empire were all still there. They just could not find each other anymore. They had not destroyed the Dominion, they had unplugged it. I spent hours on the bridge, working through the fragmented data, and the picture that emerged was not one of sabotage or espionage in any conventional sense. The humans had not broken into our systems the way an infiltrator would. They had not planted destructive programs or exploited software vulnerabilities, or brute-forced encryption barriers. What they had done was both simpler and more terrifying than any of those things. They had spent 40 years mapping us. 40 years. From the day their survey ships first detected the dominion of the Eternal Throne, long before we had any interest in their corridor of space, long before the Expansion Synod had drawn a line on a star chart through their territory, the humans had been quietly, patiently, methodically mapping every single piece of Dominion infrastructure. Not spying, not stealing secrets, mapping, understanding, documenting. They had treated the entire Dominion, all 900 systems, all 12,000 years of accumulated technological and institutional infrastructure, as a single, unified engineering problem. They had identified every node, every connection, every dependency, every redundancy, and every single point of failure in a system so vast and so complex that we ourselves did not fully understand its architecture. And then they had solved it, the way an engineer solves a structural equation, the way a doctor diagnoses a patient, with patience, precision, and the calm confidence of a professional who has done this kind of work before. Admiral Kosar, stranded with me and 800 now purposeless warships in the emptied remains of human colonial space, received a fragmented order from the Eternal Throne sometime during the second day of the collapse. Through the chaos of rerouted communications, through backup channels that had been hastily reconstructed using ancient, pre-quantum protocols that nobody had used in centuries, a directive made it through the noise. The Eternal Throne, in its desperation, ordered a retaliatory strike against Earth. The order carried the personal seal of the sovereign himself. The order reached approximately 12% of its intended recipients across the Dominion's military apparatus. Of those 12%, fewer than half could plot a viable course to Earth's coordinates, because the navigational beacons they relied on for transit calculations now pointed to locations that would destroy any ship that followed them. Of those who managed to calculate an independent course using stellar cartography and manual navigation, their weapon systems refused to activate when the moment came. Firmware updates had been applied to their targeting computers, updates that appeared in the maintenance logs as routine, scheduled patches, updates that no one had authorized or requested, updates that carried valid Dominion security certificates, digitally signed with encryption keys that should have been locked inside the most classified vaults in the Empire, keys that should have been physically impossible for any external party to possess. The humans had not just mapped our infrastructure. They owned it. They had owned it for years, possibly for decades, sitting quietly inside our most critical systems, watching, learning, holding keys to doors we did not even know existed, capable of exercising control over our own technology at any moment of their choosing. And they had chosen for all those years not to exercise that control. They had chosen to wait. They had chosen to let us live our lives and run our empire and wage our wars without interference or interruption. They had been polite enough not to mention it. I keep returning to that detail. Across all the months I have spent analyzing the incident, compiling this report, interviewing survivors and reviewing data, that single detail is the one that haunts me at night and will not let me sleep. They could have done this at any time in the past 30 years, at minimum. They could have shut us down the day we delivered the subjugation decree. They could have shut us down years before that, when we had no hostile intent toward them whatsoever. They had the access. They had the capability. They had every right, by any standard of preemptive self-defense, to neutralize a potential threat. They chose not to. They chose to warn us. They sent us a single-page message that said, in the clearest possible language, that if we proceeded, they would end us. They gave us 30 cycles to change our minds. They gave us every possible opportunity to walk away from the edge, to reconsider, to choose a different path. And when we laughed at their warning and sent 800 warships to prove that they were wrong, they did not punish us. They did not retaliate. They did not destroy. They did not kill. They simply, quietly, precisely, and with breathtaking efficiency, made us stop. No one died. I need to say that again, because it is the detail that I keep returning to, and the detail that our military leadership keeps flinching away from, as if looking directly at it might burn them. Not a single Dominion citizen was harmed during the entire operation. No worlds were bombarded. No stations were destroyed. No soldiers were shot. No civilians were hurt. No ships were damaged. No infrastructure was permanently lost. The humans had taken a 12,000-year-old empire, the most powerful military civilization in the known galaxy, and made it cease functioning as a coordinated whole, and they had done it with precisely 0 casualties on either side. 0, not 1, not a small number presented as a moral victory. Literally 0 living beings were harmed in the process of bringing the dominion of the Eternal Throne to its knees. And that, I have come to understand, is the most terrifying thing about what happened to us. Not the capability itself, although the capability is terrifying beyond measure, but the restraint, the absolute, unwavering, almost inhuman commitment to resolving the conflict without causing harm. A weapon you can understand, a weapon you can respect, a weapon you can study and counter and build a bigger version of. But this was not a weapon. This was a demonstration of such comprehensive, intimate, cellular understanding of who we were and how we functioned that the humans could reach inside our civilization and turn off whichever components they chose, with the precision and care of a surgeon removing a tumor while leaving every healthy cell intact. We were not their enemy. We were their patient. We were their project. We were a problem they had been studying for 40 years, and when the time came to solve the problem, they solved it the way they solve everything. Completely, precisely, without unnecessary damage. On the 3rd day, as the Dominion systems continued cascading into progressive dysfunction and the 14th Armada sat motionless in empty human space, with nowhere to go and no one to fight, and no way to contact anyone who could tell us what to do next, a single ship appeared at the edge of our fleet formation. One vessel, small, unarmed, broadcasting standard civilian identification codes. making no aggressive maneuvers of any kind. Our sensors confirmed, after extensive scanning, that it was a diplomatic courier ship, lightly crewed, carrying no weapons, no military equipment, and no soldiers. It transmitted a single message on an open, unencrypted channel that every ship in the Armada could hear. The message said, "Your government would like to speak with you. We have offered to host the call. Stand by for connection." 800 warships of the most powerful military empire in the galaxy sat in formation around a single unarmed civilian courier, and not one of us could think of a single thing to do about it. Admiral Kosar stood on the bridge of the Throne of Silence and stared at the communication screen for a very long time. The silence on the bridge was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. No one offered a suggestion, or a plan, or even a question. We were 800 warships, with enough combined firepower to reduce a planet to rubble, and we were waiting for instructions from a courier ship with a crew smaller than our bridge watch. Finally, Kosar ordered a delegation assembled. He selected 6 officers, including me in my capacity as the senior intelligence analyst, to board the human diplomatic station and participate in whatever conversation was about to take place. He did not call it a negotiation. He did not call it a surrender. He did not give it a name at all. He simply said, "Go and find out what they want." I was chosen because I was the highest-ranking intelligence professional in the fleet. I believe there was another reason as well, one that Kosar would never have stated aloud. None of the officers who outranked me in the command structure wanted their names attached to whatever was about to happen. History remembers the people who were in the room when empires knelt, and no one was eager to be remembered that way. We boarded a diplomatic shuttle, 6 Dominion officers in full ceremonial dress uniforms, wearing our ranks and decorations and sidearms, flying in a small shuttle toward a small station staffed by the people who had just demonstrated, beyond any possible doubt or denial, that our ranks and decorations and sidearms and 800 warships and 12,000 years of military tradition were all operating at their discretion and continued to exist only because they had not yet decided otherwise. The human station was modest. That was the first thing I noticed as our shuttle approached, and I use the word modest the way you might use it to describe a craftsman's workshop rather than a factory. It was a small orbital platform, cleanly designed, efficiently organized, with none of the military displays, commemorative monuments, trophy cases, or symbols of martial power that every Dominion installation features prominently. There were no statues of past victories, no banners celebrating conquests, no murals depicting great battles, no monument to anything except functional engineering. The humans who greeted us at the docking port wore civilian clothing, professional, neat, unremarkable. They were courteous and welcoming, in the way that hotel staff are courteous and welcoming. They introduced themselves by name and title, shook our hands or offered the equivalent greeting for each species in our delegation, and escorted us through clean, well-lit corridors to a conference room with a wide viewport that overlooked the empty expanse of space where our armada sat in impotent formation. I counted the human personnel we passed on the walk from the docking port to the conference room. I counted 19 human beings on a station that was managing the resolution of a galactic-scale military confrontation involving hundreds of thousands of warships and hundreds of billions of citizens. 19 people, and most of them appeared to be administrative support staff. The conference room was well lit, simply furnished, and deliberately designed to put visitors at ease. A long table of polished light-colored wood, comfortable chairs that adjusted automatically to accommodate different species' anatomies, carafes of water, and a dark beverage I later learned was called coffee, arranged neatly in the center. Through the viewport, the running lights of the 14th Armada twinkled in the distance, like a field of impotent stars. A woman stood at the far end of the table. She was average height by human standards, with short dark hair, sharp intelligent eyes, and the kind of calm, settled expression that comes not from practiced composure, but from absolute certainty in one's position and one's capabilities. She was not nervous. She was not excited. She was not performing confidence the way our military leaders perform it, with rigid posture and controlled voices and carefully managed facial expressions. She was simply calm, the way a person is calm when they are doing routine work they have done many times before. Admiral Kosar refused the water when it was offered. He stood with his arms rigid at his sides, and his jaw set in an expression of determined dignity, as if he could maintain the gravity of the Dominion through sheer force of physical bearing. The woman who had offered the water did not react to his refusal. She simply poured herself a glass, took a sip, and said, "Suit yourself." She introduced herself, Catherine Langford, Director of the Conflict Termination Bureau. She held the title of Termination Director. She spoke without notes, without a prepared statement, without any of the theatrical preamble that Dominion officials deploy at the opening of any formal proceeding. "I want to begin by acknowledging that this situation is difficult for you," she said, her voice level and her tone conversational. "You represent an institution with 12,000 years of continuous history, and the events of the past 72 hours have fundamentally challenged the assumptions upon which that institution has operated for its entire existence. I respect the weight of that. But I also need to be direct with you, Admiral, because clarity now will save significant time and unnecessary suffering later." Then she did something that no adversary, in 900 years of Dominion warfare, had ever done. She told us exactly what she had done to us. Everything. In precise, clinical, dispassionate, technical detail, she provided exact timelines for each phase of the operation. She named the specific infrastructure systems that had been targeted and described the technical methods used to compromise them. She identified the personnel within her bureau who had been responsible for each component of the operation. She provided the dates, some stretching back over 30 years, on which her team had first gained access to each of the Dominion's critical systems. She was not boasting. I want to be very clear about that. There was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction, no contempt, no subtle enjoyment of our discomfort. She was filing a report. She was providing a technical briefing about a completed operation to the parties affected by it, the way a civil engineer might describe a successfully completed infrastructure project to the city council that commissioned it. Her tone was professional, her language was precise, and her delivery was as emotional as a maintenance log. When she finished the operational summary, which took approximately 40 minutes, she produced a second document. It was bound in a simple cover and approximately 200 pages long. She slid it across the table toward Admiral Kosar. It was a complete restoration protocol, a step-by-step technical manual for restoring every single system the humans had disabled. Banking networks, navigational buoys, communication grids, weapons firmware, security protocols, and all of the above. Every system that had been switched off could be switched back on. The document provided detailed instructions for doing so. Catherine Langford stated, in the same level tone she had used for the entire briefing, that with human technical assistance, full restoration of all Dominion systems could be completed in approximately 11 standard days. Without human assistance, using only Dominion resources, technical knowledge, and engineering capabilities, she estimated the restoration timeline at approximately 90 standard years. The room was very quiet after she said that. Admiral Kosar picked up the restoration document. His hands were not steady. He opened it and read the first page, then the second, then the third. Then he set it down on the table and looked at Catherine Langford with an expression I had never seen on his face in 2 years of serving under his command. It was not anger, it was not humiliation, it was not defiance or resignation, or any of the emotions I would have expected from a Dominion admiral in this situation. It was the expression of a man who has spent his entire life believing he understands the dimensions of the room he stands in, only to discover that the room is 1,000 times larger than he ever imagined, and that he has been standing in one small corner of it all along. "What are your terms?" he asked. His voice was steady. I will give him that much credit. His hands shook, but his voice did not. Catherine Langford held up 3 fingers. 3 conditions. First, the subjugation decree issued against human space is withdrawn, permanently, not suspended, not tabled for future review, not shelved pending further consideration. Withdrawn and stricken from the record, with a formal published acknowledgement that it was issued in error and that the Dominion has no claim, historical or otherwise, to any human territory. Kosar nodded once. This condition was expected. It was the minimum that any power in the Dominion's position would anticipate. Second, a formal non-aggression compact will be signed between the Dominion of the Eternal Throne and the United Human Governance, The terms of the compact are detailed in the appendix of the document before you. They include enforcement mechanisms that we have already designed, tested, and prepared for implementation. These mechanisms are based not on mutual trust, but on mutual verification. Trust, she said, with the faintest suggestion of something that might have been a smile in a different context, is a lovely concept. Engineering is more reliable. Kossar nodded again, though I noticed several members of our delegation shift in their chairs at the remark about trust. The second condition was also within the range of expected outcomes. Third, Catherine Langford said, and here her voice did not change in pitch, volume, or tempo, remaining perfectly level and perfectly calm and perfectly controlled. The Dominion of the Eternal Throne will publish, in full, to all 900 of its member species, a complete and unedited account of the events of the past 72 hours, the events leading up to them, and the terms of this agreement. No propaganda, no revised narrative, no face-saving euphemisms, no selective omission, the truth, every detail, including a complete transcript of this conversation. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It filled the conference room like a physical substance, pressing against the walls and the viewport and the chest of every Dominion officer present. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear Kossar breathing. I could hear the faint hum of the station's environmental systems, the only thing in the room that was still functioning normally. Kossar's composure broke. It did not shatter. He did not shout or pound the table or issue threats. The break was quieter and worse than that. The mask of professional military dignity that he had worn for every moment of his career simply cracked, and what showed through the crack was raw and unguarded and deeply, fundamentally wounded. "You are asking us to humiliate ourselves before our own people," he said. "You are asking us to tell 900 species that a government bureau with fewer employees than my personal staff brought the Dominion of the Eternal Throne to its knees without a single shot fired." Catherine Langford did not blink. She did not lean forward, or narrow her eyes, or adjust her posture in any of the ways that signal aggressive intent. She remained exactly as she had been, hands resting on the table, expression calm, voice level. "No, Admiral," she said. "I am asking you to educate them. Your empire has maintained 400 simultaneous military campaigns for centuries. You have normalized the suffering of billions of sentient beings as an acceptable tool of statecraft. Entire species live under your control not because they chose to join you, but because you threatened to destroy them if they did not comply. You have built an empire on the principle that the ability to inflict harm is the same thing as the right to govern, and you have never been challenged on that principle because no one has ever been in a position to challenge it successfully." She paused, not for dramatic effect, to let the words settle. "We are not punishing you, Admiral. We are showing your own citizens what a competent adversary looks like, so that they can begin asking their leaders the questions they should have been asking for 12,000 years. Questions like, why are we fighting 400 wars? Who benefits from them? What would our civilization look like if we directed those resources toward building instead of breaking? Those are not our questions to answer. They are yours. But your citizens cannot ask them if they do not know the truth about what happened here." Kossar opened his mouth to respond, then he closed it. He turned to his second officer, Commander Hale Torin, as if looking for support, for a counter-argument, for anything he could use to push back against the terrible, patient, immovable logic of what Langford was saying. Torin was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who desperately wishes he were anywhere else in the galaxy. The discussion that followed, which I hesitate to call a negotiation, because a negotiation implies that both parties have leverage, lasted 4 additional hours. Every attempt by Kossar to modify the third condition was met with the same patient, thorough, devastatingly well-supported clarity from Catherine Langford. She did not raise her voice. She did not make threats, explicit or implicit. She did not reference the Dominion's current helplessness or remind Kossar that she held the only copy of the Restoration Protocol. She simply explained, each time, with different examples and from different angles, why full public transparency was essential to the long-term stability of the resolution, and each explanation was more devastating than the last because each one was built on specific, verifiable facts about the Dominion's own history that Kossar could not dispute. During a scheduled recess in the proceedings, I stepped away from the delegation. I told Kosser I needed to stretch my legs and clear my head. The truth was that I needed to ask a question that had been building in me since the moment we docked at the station, a question that I needed to ask someone who was not Catherine Langford, because I was not entirely certain I could maintain my professional composure in her presence. I found a junior human staff member in a corridor near the conference room. He was young, with dark hair and an easy, relaxed posture. His name badge read Daniel Price, Logistics Coordinator. He was leaning against the wall, drinking coffee from a ceramic mug, and reading something on a small tablet device. He looked up when I approached, smiled politely, and waited for me to speak with the patient attentiveness of someone who has all the time in the world. "I have a question," I said. "Of course," he replied. I took a breath. "Why did you not destroy us? You clearly possess the capability. You have demonstrated, conclusively and beyond any possibility of doubt, that you can reach into every system the Dominion possesses and do whatever you wish with it. You could have collapsed our reactor networks. You could have vented our orbital stations into the vacuum. You could have turned our own weapons systems against our own worlds. You could have sterilized our planets from orbit using our own orbital bombardment platforms. The capability is there. Why did you not use it?" Daniel Price looked at me with an expression of genuine confusion, not performed confusion, not diplomatic deflection disguised as surprise, real, honest, unfeigned confusion, the kind of confused expression you see on a person's face when they are asked a question so obvious that they cannot understand why it needs to be asked. "Why would we?" he said. I stared at him. "Your civilization is not broken," he continued, as if explaining something elementary to a colleague who had momentarily forgotten a basic principle. "Your government made a bad decision. A very bad decision, admittedly, but still a decision, and decisions can be corrected. We corrected the decision. If we had destroyed you, that would mean we had failed. That would mean we were incapable of resolving the conflict without causing harm, and causing harm is not resolution. It is just a different kind of failure. A more dramatic kind, maybe. A more permanent kind, but still a failure." He took another sip of his coffee. "We do not accept failure as an outcome," he added, as if this were a casual observation about the weather. "Is there anything else you need?" I stood in that corridor for a long time after he walked away. I stood there and thought about what he had said, and tried to find the angle, the manipulation, the hidden strategic calculation behind his words. I am an intelligence analyst. Finding hidden meanings and concealed motivations is what I do. It is all I have ever done. I could not find one. There was nothing hidden. He meant exactly what he said. The idea of destroying us had not merely been rejected. It had not been considered in the first place. It existed outside the boundaries of what the humans considered an acceptable range of outcomes. The way walking through a wall exists outside the acceptable range of travel options for a person in a building. You do not decide not to walk through the wall. The option simply does not present itself. I returned to the conference room. I sat in my chair. I did not speak for the remainder of the proceedings. The compact was signed. All three conditions were accepted. Admiral Kosser signed his name to the document, with a hand that trembled visibly, and Catherine Langford signed hers, with the same steady, unhurried calm she had maintained from the very first moment we entered the room. As our delegation walked back through the corridors toward the docking port, I looked over my shoulder through a viewport at the conference room we had just left. The human staff were already clearing the table, removing the water carafes and coffee service, wiping down the surface, straightening the chairs, adjusting the lighting back to its default setting. They were not celebrating, they were not congratulating each other, or shaking hands, or embracing, or marking this moment with any gesture of significance whatsoever. They were cleaning up. They were resetting the room to its neutral state, preparing it for whatever meeting, or briefing, or conference might need it next. For them, this was a completed task. A file closed, a case resolved. An item checked off a list and moved to the archive. A civilization of 400 billion citizens, occupying 900 star systems, commanding tens of thousands of warships, backed by 12,000 years of military tradition, and 900 years of unbroken conquest, had just formally capitulated to a government bureau with fewer employees than a medium-sized restaurant chain. And the employees of that bureau were tidying up the conference room as if it were the end of an ordinary workday. Kosser sat across from me on the shuttle ride back to the throne of silence. He did not speak. His hands rested in his lap, and they were still shaking, and he made no effort to hide it, because there was no one left to perform composure for. The shame on his face was not the shame of defeat. It was something more personal, and more permanent than that. It was the shame of a creature that has spent its entire life believing it was the most dangerous thing in any room it entered, only to discover that the quiet, pleasant person sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee could have ended the conversation at any moment, and had simply chosen not to. Out of basic professional courtesy. I watched the human station shrink in the shuttle's viewport as we pulled away. It was already running dark, powering down non-essential systems, returning to standby mode. Catherine Langford and Daniel Price and their team of fewer than 20 people were probably already packing their personal belongings and reviewing their travel arrangements for the return trip home. For them, this was a Tuesday. I am writing this report 18 months after the events I have described. The dominion of the Eternal Throne still exists, technically. Its systems were restored in 9 standard days, with human technical assistance, 2 days ahead of Catherine Langford's estimated timeline. The navigational buoys were recalibrated. The financial networks were rebuilt from archived backup data that the humans helped us locate within our own systems. The communication grid was restored, this time with security protocols that the humans helped us design, protocols whose architecture we could not have developed ourselves in a century of dedicated effort. But the empire that was restored is not the same empire that fell. The machine works again, the lights are on, the money flows, the ships can navigate, the messages reach their intended recipients, but something fundamental has changed, something that cannot be repaired, or restored, or patched, because it was never a system to begin with. It was a belief. And beliefs, once broken, do not reset to factory defaults. The Dominion published the full account of the incident, as the third condition of the compact required. Every detail, every timeline, every technical specification, every word of the negotiation transcripts, including Kossar's trembling hands, and my conversation with Daniel Price in the corridor. Everything, distributed to every communication terminal in all 900 member systems, in every language, without editorial comment or official interpretation. The effect was immediate, overwhelming, and irreversible. 12 subject species filed formal petitions for independence within the first month. Not because the Dominion suddenly lacked the military capability to prevent their departure. The ships were still there, the soldiers were still there, the weapons still functioned, the capacity for force remained intact. They filed for independence because they now knew, with documented, verified, irrefutable certainty, that the Dominion could be stopped. Not fought, not resisted through decades of painful guerrilla warfare. Stopped, completely, immediately, and without a single casualty on either side. The mythology of invincibility, the grand narrative that the Dominion had told itself and its subjects for 12,000 years, evaporated overnight. Not gradually, not through erosion or doubt. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by a documented technical report that described, in precise detail, exactly how a bureau of 800 employees had rendered the most powerful military civilization in the galaxy incapable of functioning for 3 days. It did not matter that the Dominion's fleets were intact. It did not matter that no territory had been lost to human occupation. It did not matter that the Empire's military capability was, in raw numerical terms, exactly what it had been before the incident. What mattered was that every species in the Dominion now understood, with the clarity of a published engineering report, that military capability itself was meaningless against an adversary who operated on a completely different plane. 300 years of simmering rebellions that the Dominion had contained through raw intimidation, through the ever-present implied threat of overwhelming force, simply stood up from the table and walked out the door. Not in anger, not in revolution, in calm, measured, administrative proceedings, filing paperwork, citing precedents, requesting transition timelines. Within 6 months, 47 more species had filed independence petitions. Some negotiated transition agreements. Some simply informed the Dominion of their departure and began the process of self-governance. The Dominion could have responded with force. Every officer who considered giving that order looked at the published account of what had happened and asked themselves the same question that I knew they were asking, because I was asking it too. What if the humans are watching? What if they have already extended their capability to others? What if the next time we attempt to crush a rebellion, the money stops again, and the navigation scrambles again, and the communications route to the wrong recipients again, and we find ourselves sitting in our warships with nothing to do and nowhere to go, exactly as we sat before? No one gave the order. No one dared. The Dominion did not collapse. It deflated. Slowly, steadily, quietly, like a structure losing pressure through 100 small leaks that no one could locate or repair. Not a dramatic implosion. A gradual, undeniable, irreversible diminishment. Other powers across the galaxy took notice. Of course they did. I monitored the diplomatic traffic as part of my ongoing assessment duties, and the volume of communications directed toward the Conflict Termination Bureau exceeded anything in my experience. Every major civilization, every minor alliance, every independent system, every aspiring regional power with a functioning government and a communication terminal sent formal requests for meetings with the Bureau. They all wanted to understand the same thing. Is this capability directed at us? The humans were patient with every single one of them. They met with every delegation, from the mighty to the insignificant. They answered every question with the same combination of honesty and restraint. Their response was always some variation of a single, simple, devastating statement. We do not direct it. We do not need to. It exists. That is sufficient. The elegant horror of that position is that it requires no ongoing enforcement. The humans do not need to threaten anyone. They do not need to conduct demonstrations or deploy fleets or establish military bases or project power through any of the mechanisms that every other civilization relies on. They do not need to do anything at all. They simply exist, and their existence carries an implication that every civilization in the galaxy now understands with perfect, documented clarity. If you choose to go to war with humans, you will not fight a war. You will experience a termination. Your ability to wage the conflict will simply cease to exist, and you will be presented with a restoration protocol and a set of conditions, and you will accept those conditions because the alternative is 90 years of trying to rebuild what they switched off in 72 hours. I spent the months after the incident studying human history. I read everything available in their public archives, their academic databases, their cultural records, their philosophical traditions. I was looking for the answer to a question that had consumed me since that conversation with Daniel Price in the corridor of the diplomatic station. How does a species arrive at this? How does a civilization reach the point where it replaces the concept of war with the concept of termination, and treats the distinction not as semantic, but as existential? The answer, when I found it buried in centuries of human historical records, did not comfort me. It terrified me more deeply than anything that had come before. Humans fought wars. Not a few wars, not occasional wars. Thousands of wars, spanning thousands of years, on their homeworld, long before they ever reached the stars. They fought with sharpened stones and wooden spears. They fought with metal swords and armored cavalry. They fought with chemical propellants and projectile weapons. They fought with poison gas and flying machines. They fought with splitting atoms and the radiation that follows. They fought with engineered diseases and autonomous killing machines and orbital platforms that could level entire cities from the vacuum of space. At every stage of their technological development, they escalated. At every stage, the wars grew more destructive, more efficient, more total, more indiscriminate. They developed the concept of deliberately targeting civilian populations. They developed the concept of mutually assured destruction, a strategic framework in which both sides of a conflict maintain enough destructive capability to annihilate the other completely, creating a balance of terror that prevents either side from attacking. They developed the concept of total war, in which every resource and every citizen of a nation is mobilized for the sole purpose of utterly destroying another nation. They were, by any measure, the most creatively and enthusiastically violent species the galaxy has ever produced. They fought with an inventiveness, a determination, a relentless escalatory momentum that no other civilization in the galaxy has matched or even approached. And then they stopped. They did not stop because they became peaceful. They did not stop because they evolved past violence or achieved some transcendent moral awakening or decided that war was wrong. They stopped because they became so catastrophically, comprehensively, terrifyingly good at destruction that continuing was not merely dangerous, but a guaranteed path to species-wide extinction. Literal extinction, not a metaphor, not a rhetorical exaggeration. They developed weapons that could sterilize the surface of their entire planet multiple times over. They built enough of those weapons to do it several times for good measure. And they stood on the edge of that capacity, looking down into the absolute void of self-inflicted annihilation, and something inside them shifted. Not their nature. I want to be very clear about this. Their nature did not change. They did not become less aggressive, or less competitive, or less territorial, or less creative in their approaches to conflict. What changed was their strategy. They looked at their own history with unflinching, brutal honesty. They looked at 10,000 wars. They looked at the hundreds of millions of their own kind they had ended. They looked at the weapons they had built, and the weapons they were building, and the weapons they would inevitably build next. And they reached a conclusion that no other species in the history of the galaxy has reached. They could not be trusted with war. Not that they could not afford it. Not that they should avoid it when possible. Not that it was regrettable, but sometimes necessary. That they, as a species, possessing the nature that they possess, were fundamentally, structurally, irredeemably incapable of waging war without escalating it to extinction. The way you do not trust someone who has nearly destroyed themselves to remain in proximity to the thing that nearly destroyed them. The Conflict Termination Bureau was not born from idealism, or optimism, or faith in the better angels of human nature. It was born from self-knowledge, from the terrifying, honest, unflinching, pitiless recognition that humanity's single greatest talent was the invention of new and more efficient ways to destroy, and that the only way for the species to survive its own genius was to build an institution whose sole purpose was making the exercise of that genius unnecessary. They did not learn to be peaceful. They learned to make peace the only available option, not just for themselves, for everyone they encountered, because they understood, from centuries of first-hand experience, that if war remains possible, it will eventually happen. And if it happens, it will escalate. And if it escalates long enough, someone will cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. They removed the possibility, not through moral persuasion, not through diplomacy or cultural exchange or the slow evolution of norms, through engineering, through the patient, methodical, technically rigorous process of understanding a civilization's infrastructure so completely that they could make war structurally impossible for anyone who attempted it. The new galactic reality is still forming around us like crystal growing in a solution. Arms races across the galaxy have slowed, not because species have become less aggressive or more enlightened, but because the human demonstration proved beyond argument that conventional military superiority is meaningless against an adversary who does not engage on military terms. You can build the largest fleet in the galaxy. You can develop the most devastating weapons ever conceived. You can drill your soldiers to perfection and design your strategies with genius, and fund your military-industrial complex with the combined wealth of 1,000 worlds. And none of it, not one ship, not one weapon, not one soldier, matters in the slightest if your adversary can reach into your banking system and erase your ability to pay for fuel, reroute your navigation to send your ships into dead stars, and redirect your own classified communications to your own public news channels. Several civilizations have begun requesting human consultants, not for weapons technology, which the humans do not possess, not for military strategy, which the humans do not practice, for the kind of deep systems analysis that the humans used against us. The ability to understand a civilization's infrastructure so completely that you can disable it surgically, precisely, without damage and without casualties, and then restore it once the conditions that made the intervention necessary have been addressed. The humans accept these requests selectively, with careful evaluation, and always with the same immutable condition: the knowledge must be used for termination, never prolongation; for ending conflicts, never extending them; for making war impossible, never for making it more effective. I find it deeply, persistently, inescapably unsettling that the galaxy's most effective instrument of peace is a species that nearly eradicated itself through war. I find it even more unsettling that their effectiveness comes not from having transcended violence, but from understanding it so completely, so intimately, so thoroughly that they can see it coming before it starts and remove the conditions that make it possible before the first shot is fired. They are not saints. They are not enlightened beings who have risen above the base urges of lesser species. They are reformed destroyers. They are a species that looked at its own reflection and saw a monster and decided, with the cold pragmatism that characterizes everything they do, to build a cage around the monster that was so elegant and so complete that the monster could never get out, no matter how clever it was, no matter how hard it tried, no matter how many new techniques it invented for picking locks. I have come to my final assessment, and I am going to break protocol to deliver it. This report is classified. It will be filed in the restricted archive under the highest available security designation. It will be read by a handful of senior officials who will nod gravely and do nothing with the information it contains, because the information it contains is too large and too uncomfortable and too fundamentally challenging to the assumptions upon which their careers and their identities and their understanding of the universe are built. But I will say it anyway, because it is true, and because truth does not stop being true, simply because powerful people find it inconvenient. In 900 years of active military operations, the Dominion of the Eternal Throne conquered over 600 species through the application of military force. We absorbed their territories, we exploited their resources, we suppressed their cultures, we added their populations to our labor pool. We took their brightest minds and put them to work building our ships and maintaining our infrastructure and expanding the very machine that had swallowed them whole. We called this strength, we called this power, we called this the natural order of galactic civilization, the strong consuming the weak, the inevitable trajectory of progress. Not one of those 600 conquests made the Dominion safer, not one. Every single one created a new occupied population to manage, a new border to defend, a new resentment to suppress, a new drain on resources that could have been used to build something constructive rather than to maintain a grip on something stolen. We spent 12,000 years accumulating problems and calling them victories. We built an empire on the principle that the strongest survive, and never once, in 12 millennia, stopped to ask whether survival through strength was actually working, or whether we were just running faster and faster on an ever steeper incline to stay in the same place. The humans looked at our model and saw it for what it was: not strength, addiction, an empire that could not stop conquering because it had built its entire identity around conquest, even though every new conquest made the next one harder and the empire as a whole more brittle, more overstretched, more dependent on the very cycle of violence that was slowly, inevitably, imperceptibly tearing it apart from within. We were not expanding. We were consuming ourselves one territory at a time, mistaking the growth of our borders for the growth of our civilization. And the humans did not defeat us. That is the single most important thing I need whoever reads this report to understand. They did not beat us in a contest of strength or will or strategic brilliance. They did not outfight us or outgun us or outmaneuver us on the battlefield. There was no battlefield. There was no contest. There was no war. They showed us what we were. They held up a mirror constructed from our own infrastructure, our own systems, our own technology, and they forced us to see the machine we had built and what it was actually doing. They showed us that we had been defeating ourselves for 12,000 years, through 12,000 years of conquest that achieved nothing except the expansion of the very burdens that were crushing us, and that the only thing sustaining the illusion of victory was the fact that no adversary had ever been competent enough to point it out. That is why the word war does not apply to what they did to us. War is a competition between opponents who are operating within the same framework, playing the same game, seeking the same kind of outcome through different strategies. What the humans practice is not competition. It is not strategy. It is not even conflict. It is surgery. They identified the disease. They isolated the affected systems. They removed the pathology. They restored function. The patient survived. The patient was always meant to survive. That was the entire point. That was always the entire point. I am going to sign this report now. I will stamp it with my professional seal, the same seal I once pressed into the pre-invasion assessment that rated human resistance as moderate and predicted their collapse in 3 rotations. I sign it with full awareness that it will be classified and buried and filed away where no one will ever read it, beyond what the humans already forced into the open through their 3rd condition. I do not mind. The Dominion's citizens are already asking the questions the humans wanted them to ask. I hear them in the public forums and the news debates and the conversations in the corridors of government buildings. Why do we fight so many wars? Who benefits from them? What would happen if we stopped? What kind of civilization could we build if we took the resources we pour into 400 simultaneous military campaigns and directed them towards something other than maintaining the campaigns themselves? The ending has already begun. It began long before the humans arrived. We started it 12,000 years ago when we decided that strength meant the ability to destroy and that the measure of a civilization was the number of other civilizations it had consumed. The humans did not create the ending. They simply ensured it was the right kind of ending. Not a collapse into chaos and civil war. Not a violent revolution that would replace one cycle of destruction with another. Not an extinction, a reckoning. A slow, painful, necessary, ultimately constructive reckoning with who we have been and what we could become if we chose to become something different. I asked Daniel Price, a junior logistics coordinator, drinking coffee in a corridor, why the humans did not destroy us when they had the capability to do so. He said that destroying us would mean they had failed. I have thought about that answer every day for 18 months, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone you found on a beach, examining it from every angle, looking for the flaw, the crack, the hidden weakness that would reveal it as a deception or a manipulation. There is no flaw. There is no crack. He meant exactly what he said. He was telling the truth, not a diplomatic truth or a strategic truth or a carefully constructed version of the truth designed to serve an ulterior purpose. He was stating a simple, genuine, deeply held belief, as natural to him as breathing, as fundamental to his worldview as gravity. The humans do not fight wars. They end them. And the most terrifying thing about that statement is not its implications for military strategy or geopolitical balance or the future of galactic civilization. The most terrifying thing is that it is not a threat. It is not a warning. It is not a promise made in anger, or a boast delivered with clenched fists, or a declaration of superiority shouted from the bridge of a warship. It is simply what they do. The way breathing is what they do. The way gravity is what planets do. The way stars burn, and galaxies turn, and time moves forward. It is a fact of the universe, as natural, and as inevitable, and as impossible to argue with, as the laws that govern the motion of every atom in existence. We sent 800 warships to conquer them. They sent 20 civilians to save us from ourselves. I am Senior Doctrine Analyst Vaithari Son, and this is my final report. May whoever reads it be wise enough to understand what the humans already know, that the measure of a civilization is not its capacity for destruction, but its willingness to make destruction unnecessary. End of report. Filed under restricted access. Distribution limited to synod clearance and above. Not that it matters. The humans already know what it says.